Imagine waking up on the morning of August 24th in the year 410. You are a Roman citizen. You live inside the greatest city the world has ever seen. The streets outside your window are already buzzing. Vendors setting up stalls, soldiers changing shifts at the gates, the smell of bread from the bakeries 3 blocks down. Children are running. Priests are chanting somewhere in the distance. The aqueducts are flowing. The fountains are alive. Rome is eternal. Everyone knows this. The city has stood for over 1,000 years. It has survived plague, civil war, the madness of emperors, the ambitions of generals. It has been tested by Hannibal, by the Gauls, by every enemy the ancient world could produce, and it has buried them all. The marble is still white. The Senate still meets. The bread dole still runs. Life, as you have always known it, continues. And then, by nightfall of that same day, everything you believed about the world will be wrong. The Visigoths are inside the walls, not camped outside them, not negotiating at the gates, inside, moving through the streets, armed, organized, and completely unopposed. For the first time in 800 years, 8 centuries, a foreign enemy army is walking through the heart of Rome. The date is fixed. The sources are clear. The historian Sozomen, writing in the 5th century, records it. Jerome, one of the most important Christian scholars of the age, writes about it from his monastery in Bethlehem, and he does so in a state of visible shock. Procopius references it. Augustine of Hippo, perhaps the most influential theologian in Christian history, is so disturbed by the event that it prompts him to begin writing one of the most important books of the ancient world, The City of God. This was not a minor skirmish. This was not a border incident. This was the moment the Roman world cracked open. But here is the question that historians have been wrestling with for over 1,500 years, and the question we are going to investigate today. What actually happened inside Rome during those first 48 hours? Not in the grand sweep of history, not in the political aftermath, not in the centuries of decline that followed, but in those specific, terrifying, chaotic hours between the moment the gates opened and the moment the Visigoths finally marched out 3 days later. What happened to the 1 million people living inside those walls? Because Rome in 410 was not an empty city. It was not a symbol. It was not an abstraction. It was a living, breathing, crowded, complicated human metropolis. Estimates from scholars at the University of Rome and from demographic studies published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology place the city's population at somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million people at its height. Even accounting for population decline in the decades before the sack, the city in 410 almost certainly still held somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 inhabitants. 500,000 to 800,000 human beings. In a single night, their world ended. And yet, if you read the standard history books, those people are almost invisible. You get political analysis, you get the story of the Visigoth king Alaric, you get the theological response of Augustine, you get the long arc of imperial collapse. But you almost never get the street level. You almost never get the 48 hours. That is what we are going to try to reconstruct today. Using every source we have, and we have more than most people realize. Roman letters, church records, archaeological evidence excavated from beneath modern Rome, the testimony of survivors recorded by historians within decades of the event, the physical evidence still buried under the streets of the eternal. Layer by layer, hour by hour, we are going to try to understand what it actually felt like to be inside Rome when the unthinkable happened. But before we can understand those 48 hours, we need to understand the months that came before them, because the fall of Rome did not happen in a single night. It had been coming for a very long time, and the citizens of Rome had been watching it approach with a kind of paralyzed disbelief. The way you might watch a storm building on the horizon, telling yourself, it will turn, it always turns, right up until the moment the first lightning strikes your roof. Alaric and his Visigoths had already besieged Rome twice, once in 408, again in 409. Both times the city had survived, through negotiation, through bribery, through desperate diplomacy. Both times Alaric had eventually withdrawn his forces and moved on, leaving Rome shaken but intact. The Roman Senate had paid him off, enormous quantities of gold, 5,000 pounds of it according to the historian Zosimus, along with 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 scarlet-dyed hides, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. Pepper, an exotic spice worth its weight in silver in the ancient world. That is what Rome's survival had cost after the first siege. And yet the crisis never truly resolved. The Western Emperor Honorius, safely barricaded in the fortified city of Ravenna, refused to negotiate seriously with Alaric, refused to give him the land and the military command he wanted, refused to acknowledge the reality of Visigoth power. Honorius was, by most historical accounts, a spectacularly ineffective ruler, more interested in his chickens, according to one famous anecdote, than in the fate of his empire's greatest city. So Alaric came back. By the summer of 410, the Visigoths had been camped outside Rome's walls for the third time. The city was under blockade. Food supplies were running low. The aqueducts were threatened. The population, already stressed from 2 previous sieges, was growing desperate. And then, on the night of August 23rd to 24th, something happened that historians still debate. The Salarian Gate opened. From the inside. How? Why? Who opened it? The sources are frustratingly incomplete. Procopius, writing over a century later, claims that slaves loyal to Alaric opened the gate. He names a noblewoman, a widow named Proba, as the person who ordered it opened, supposedly to end the city's suffering under the blockade. Other sources suggest treachery. Some ancient writers hint at bribery. Some suggest the gate's defenders simply fled or surrendered. What the archaeological record shows is this. There is evidence of burning near the Salarian Gate. Excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly work conducted under the auspices of the Soprintendenza Speciale di Roma, have uncovered ash layers and destruction debris in the areas closest to that gate. This is consistent with an assault, a forced entry, or fire set in the chaos of the opening moments. What we know for certain is that by the early hours of August 24th, 410, Alaric's forces were inside Rome. And for the 1 million people sleeping in that city, nothing would ever be the same again. The gates open, the first hours. The night of August 23rd was hot. This is not a dramatic embellishment. Late August in Rome is brutal. The kind of heat that sits on the city like a weight, that radiates back up from the stone streets long after the sun has gone down. The kind of night where sleep comes slowly, where people lie awake listening to the city breathe around them. And on this particular night, the city was not breathing normally. Even before the gates opened, something was wrong. Veterans of the 2 previous sieges could feel it. The blockade had been tightening for weeks. Food prices inside the walls had reached levels that ordinary Romans could not pay. According to Zosimus, whose New History remains one of our primary sources for this period, the situation inside Rome before the final breach had become catastrophic. He describes people dying of starvation in the streets. He describes the smell. He describes a city that was already in some ways dying before a single Visigoth soldier set foot inside. So when the Salarian Gate opened, in whatever way it opened, for whatever reason, it did not open onto a city of confident, well-fed, organized Romans ready to resist. It opened onto a city that was already on its knees. Picture the geography. The Salarian Gate stood in the northeastern section of the Aurelian Walls, the massive defensive circuit built by Emperor Aurelian between 271 and 275, stretching for nearly 19 kilometers around the city. Those walls were formidable, up to 6 meters thick in places, towers every 30 meters, gates reinforced with iron and stone. But walls are only as strong as the people defending them, and in 410, the defenders were exhausted, hungry, and, crucially, largely without professional military leadership. The mobile field armies of the Western Empire were not in Rome. They were in the north, or in Ravenna with the emperor, or simply gone. What remained inside the walls was a garrison of uncertain quality, a city militia, and the prayers of a terrified population. When the gate opened, the Visigoths moved through it in organized formation. This is an important detail that changes the character of what followed. Alaric's forces were not a screaming barbarian horde in the way that Roman propaganda had always described its enemies. By 410, the Visigoths had been living within or alongside the Roman Empire for over 30 years. Alaric himself had served as a Roman military commander, a magister militum. His troops had fought in Roman armies. Many of them were Christian, the same faith as the majority of Rome's population by this point. They wore Roman-influenced equipment. They understood Roman urban space, the layout of forums, basilicas, warehouses, temples. This was not a clash of alien worlds. This was something more complicated, and in some ways, more frightening, because it meant the sack that followed had a terrible kind of efficiency to it. The Visigoths knew what they were looking for. They knew where the wealth was concentrated. They knew the difference between a private home and an imperial treasury. They knew which buildings mattered and which did not. So what happened in those first hours, between the gate opening in the darkness and the dawn breaking over a city that had already changed forever? The sources give us fragments, painful, vivid fragments. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, preserves the accounts of refugees who fled Rome and eventually made their way to the eastern Mediterranean. He writes with raw emotion. He calls Rome the city that had taken the whole world captive, and describes its fall as something that made the whole world tremble. He records that noble women, women of the senatorial class, women who had never known physical hardship in their lives, were suddenly running through the streets in darkness, barefoot, trying to reach churches, trying to reach their children, trying to find any place that felt safe. That image, noble women running barefoot through Roman streets at night, is one of the most striking in all the sources, and it tells us something important. The terror was immediate. It was not organized resistance that characterized the first hours. It was flight, hiding, the desperate search for sanctuary. And here is where the story takes a turn that surprises many people when they first encounter it. The churches held, not metaphorically, literally. Alaric had given explicit orders, and this is documented in multiple sources, including Orosius and Augustine, that Christian churches were to be treated as places of sanctuary. Anyone who took refuge in a church was not to be harmed. The property of the churches was not to be looted. This was not generosity, it was theology. Alaric was a Christian, an Arian Christian, which put him at odds with Roman Catholic orthodoxy, but a Christian nonetheless. He understood the symbolic power of being seen to respect the holy sites of his co-religionists. He understood that sacking churches would turn the entire Christian world against him in a way that sacking palaces would not. So as the Visigoths moved through the city in those first dark hours, two things were happening simultaneously. In the streets and the houses and the palaces, chaos, terror, and violence. In the churches, an extraordinary, fragile sanctuary. The Basilica of St. Peter on the far side of the Tiber, the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, the Lateran Basilica, which had been the seat of the Roman bishop since Constantine's time. These became, in the space of a single night, refugee centers holding thousands of people. Archaeological work conducted in the late 20th century, particularly excavations associated with projects beneath the Vatican and along the old Appian Way, has found evidence consistent with rapid, large-scale population movement during this period, including hordes of buried valuables that were never recovered by their owners. When a family buries gold coins or silver plate and never comes back to dig it up, it tells you something about what happened to that family. The Museo Nazionale Romano holds several such hoards, recovered from contexts dating to the early 5th century, buried beneath floors or in garden spaces. The desperate acts of people who expected to return and never did. But back to those first hours. As dawn began to lighten the sky over Rome on August 24th, 410, the city was undergoing a transformation that no living Roman had ever witnessed, and none had ever truly believed possible. The sounds alone must have been extraordinary. Screaming, running feet on stone, the crash of doors being forced, horses in the forum, horses, animals that belonged in the countryside, now clattering through spaces that had been reserved for the most formal rituals of Roman civic life. The smell of smoke beginning to rise from somewhere to the northeast, near the Salarian Gate, near the house of the wealthy Senator Sallust, whose property the sources record as being among the first major structures to burn. And underneath all of it, silence from the places you would have expected sound. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, empty. No emperor, no imperial guard in full strength, no organized military response. Because the emperor was not there. Honorius was in Ravenna, 350 kilometers away, behind his own walls, and he was going to stay there. Rome was burning, and the man whose title was Emperor of the Western Romans was not coming. That abandonment, that fundamental betrayal of the relationship between ruler and city, is perhaps the deepest wound of August 410. Not the Visigoths at the gate, not the looting that followed, but the absolute confirmation, written in fire and silence, that the empire had already left Rome behind. The people in those streets, in those churches, hiding in those cellars, they were alone. And the next 48 hours would test every one of them in ways that history has only partially recorded. Inside the storm, what the survivors remembered. We need to pause here and talk about evidence, because when we try to reconstruct what happened inside Rome during those 48 hours, we are working with a specific and sometimes frustrating set of sources. We are not working with newspapers. We are not working with photographs. We are not working with official incident reports. What we have is this. We have the accounts of people who were there and survived, filtered through the pens of writers who recorded their testimony within decades of the event. We have letters. We have sermons. We have legal documents that reference the chaos of this period. We have the physical evidence buried beneath modern Rome. The ash layers, the coin hoards, the burned building remains that archaeologists have been carefully excavating and cataloging for over a century. And together, these sources paint a picture that is more detailed, more human, and more heartbreaking than most people expect. Let us start with what the survivors said. Jerome, sitting in his monastery in Bethlehem, was receiving refugees from Rome throughout the years 410 and 411. These were people who had lived through it, who had been inside the walls, who had run through those streets, and he records their accounts, not always with the clinical precision of a modern historian, but with the raw texture of someone listening to people in genuine shock. One of the most striking things the refugees described was the silence. Not constant noise and violence everywhere, but patches of terrible silence. Whole neighborhoods where nothing moved. Streets where the normal sounds of Roman life, the vendors, the arguments, the children, the animals, had simply stopped, as if the city had held its breath and not yet decided whether to exhale. This is psychologically consistent with what modern scholars of urban conflict describe as the freeze response in civilian populations during sudden military occupation. People hid. They stayed inside. They did not know the rules of what was happening, and until they did, the safest thing was stillness. But stillness was not unique, because simultaneously, other parts of the city were experiencing something entirely different. The looting was systematic, organized, and it moved through Rome in waves. The Visigoths targeted specific locations first: the imperial storehouses on the Palatine and Aventine hills, the treasury facilities near the Forum, the warehouses along the Tiber docks, enormous complexes that stored the grain, oil, wine, and luxury goods that fed and supplied the city. These were military objectives as much as they were acts of plunder. Alaric understood supply. He understood logistics. He had been a Roman military commander. He knew that controlling the warehouses meant controlling the city's ability to function. The historian Orosius, writing his History Against the Pagans within 15 years of the sack, provides some of the most specific detail we have about the looting. He describes Visigoth soldiers moving through the city carrying specific lists, or at minimum, specific knowledge, of where the most valuable imperial property was held. This was not random. This was an army that had spent months camped outside Rome, that had informants inside, that had negotiated with Roman officials during 2 previous sieges and learned a great deal about the city's layout and resources in the process. Among the most significant items taken, and this is documented across multiple sources, was the treasure of Solomon's temple. This requires a moment of explanation, because the history behind it is extraordinary. When the Roman general Titus sacked Jerusalem in the year 70, he looted the Second Temple before destroying it. The treasures of the temple, the great golden menorah, the table of the shewbread, the silver trumpets, were brought back to Rome in triumph. They are depicted carved in stone with remarkable detail on the Arch of Titus, which still stands today in the Roman Forum. Visitors can see them there right now. The relief sculpture showing Roman soldiers carrying the menorah through the streets of Rome in triumph. Those treasures had been in Rome for 340 years, and now, in 410, they were carried out of Rome by Alaric's forces. Procopius, writing in the 6th century, traces their subsequent journey, from Rome to Carthage when the Vandals sacked that city in 477, and then reportedly to Constantinople. Their ultimate fate remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries, but their removal from Rome in 410 is documented. The Arch of Titus shows us what they looked like. The sources tell us they left. 340 years of Roman possession, gone in 48 hours. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are still inside those first hours, still inside the city, still with the people hiding in their homes and flooding into the churches. Let us talk about the violence, because it happened, and it is important to understand its character, both what it was and what, remarkably, it was not. There was killing. The sources are clear on this. People who resisted were killed. People who were found guarding valuables were killed or beaten. There are accounts of assault and rape. Jerome records them with obvious anguish, and the theological response to the violation of consecrated women becomes a significant thread in Augustine's subsequent writing. This was real. This was part of the 48 hours. But here is what the sources also show, and what makes the sack of Rome in 410 genuinely different from many other ancient city sacks. The killing was not indiscriminate. This is not a defense of what happened. It is a historical observation that carries enormous significance for understanding those 48 hours. Alaric's orders regarding the churches were enforced. The sources, Orosius, Augustine, Sozomen, all confirm this. People who reached the basilicas were protected. There are specific accounts of Visigoth soldiers escorting Roman citizens to churches, of armed men guaranteeing safe passage to those who claimed sanctuary. Augustine himself, in The City of God, uses this as a theological argument, pointing to the protection offered in Christian churches as evidence of God's mercy operating even through the instrument of the barbarian sack. The archaeological evidence supports a picture of selective rather than total destruction. The Lateran Basilica survives this period without evidence of significant damage. The early Christian catacombs outside the walls, which might have been targeted for their silver fittings and artistic wealth, show no evidence of systematic looting from this period. The major pagan temples of the Old Forum were not burned, though they were looted of their metal fittings and portable valuables. Contrast this with what happened to private property. The houses of the Roman senatorial class, the enormous multi-story urban mansions that occupied entire city blocks, were systematically stripped, not just of gold and silver, but of furniture, textiles, artwork, horses, food stores, anything of value or utility. The Visigoth army had been in the field for years. They needed everything, and the great houses of Rome contained everything an army in the field could want. The experience of being a wealthy Roman in those 48 hours was therefore uniquely terrible in a specific way. Your life might be spared, but your entire material world, the physical expression of your family's generations of accumulated status, was going to be taken apart in front of you. We have actual testimony about this experience. Marcella was an elderly Roman noblewoman, a widow of extraordinary piety and social prominence, who had converted her home into a kind of proto-monastic community decades before the sack. Jerome knew her personally. She was, by all accounts, one of the most respected Christian women in Rome. On August 24th, 410, Visigoth soldiers entered her home. Jerome records what happened next with obvious grief, because Marcella died shortly afterward from her injuries. The soldiers beat her, trying to force her to reveal where her valuables were hidden. She had none. She had given her wealth away years before. They did not believe her. They beat her again. Eventually, and this detail is remarkable, other Visigoth soldiers intervened. They took her to the Basilica of St. Paul. They protected her. She survived the sack itself, dying weeks later from her injuries, but she survived the 48 hours. That story contains, in miniature, the entire terrible complexity of what those hours were like. Violence and protection existing simultaneously. The same forces capable of brutality and of mercy, sometimes within the same hour, sometimes performed by the same people. Now let us move through the city geographically, because Rome in 410 was not one uniform experience. It was a city of distinct neighborhoods, hills, and populations, and what happened in those 48 hours was dramatically different depending on where you were. On the Palatine Hill, the ancient heart of imperial Rome, where the emperors had built their palaces over centuries of accumulated construction, the Visigoths moved quickly and with clear purpose. This was where the symbols of Roman imperial power were concentrated. This is where Alaric's forces focused some of their earliest and most intensive attention. The imperial palace complex was stripped. Statues were pulled down, not all of them, but those made of precious metals. Decorative fittings, door hardware, roof tiles of gilded bronze, all of it came off. The physical damage to the Palatine was severe enough that subsequent archaeological layers show a clear disruption in the material record at this period. Excavations conducted by the German Archaeological Institute in Rome, which has been working on the Palatine systematically since the 19th century, have identified destruction layers consistent with the events of 410, ash, collapsed roof material, and evidence of fire in several structures. Down from the Palatine, in the dense residential neighborhoods of the Suburra, the crowded, noisy, multi-story apartment district that housed the bulk of Rome's ordinary population, the experience was different again. The Suburra was not where the money was. The insulae, the great apartment blocks, some rising 6 or 7 stories, housed working Romans, freed slaves, small traders, artisans. They had little that a conquering army wanted in terms of portable wealth, which means they experienced the 48 hours primarily as terror rather than as targeted looting. They heard it happening. They smelled the smoke. They listened to the sounds moving through the city and tried to calculate, is it coming this way? Is my building safe? Should I run to a church? Should I stay hidden? For these hundreds of thousands of ordinary Romans, those 48 hours were experienced as a kind of suspended, suffocating dread. The violence might reach them, or it might not. There was no way to know. All they could do was wait. And in that waiting, in those hours of terrible uncertainty, the city of 1 million people was fracturing along lines that would never fully heal. The geography of survival, hill by hill, hour by hour. Let us walk through Rome together. Not the Rome of tourist maps and postcard images, the Rome of August 24th, 410. The Rome of smoke and running feet and locked doors and desperate prayers whispered in the dark. Because geography mattered enormously in those 48 hours. Where you were in the city when the gates opened could mean the difference between survival and death, between keeping everything and losing everything, between a story you could tell your grandchildren and a silence that no one ever recorded. Rome in 410 was built across 7 hills, but it had long since spilled far beyond those hills, filling the valleys between them with dense construction, crossing the Tiber into the Trastevere neighborhood on the western bank, spreading south along the Appian Way and north toward the Salarian Gate. The Aurelian walls enclosed an area of approximately 13 square kilometers. Within that space, the population density in some neighborhoods was extraordinary, comparable, some modern demographers suggest, to the densest urban areas in the contemporary world. 13 square kilometers, 500,000 to 800,000 people. Do the mathematics. That is a city packed almost beyond imagination. And now place an armed force of somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 Visigoth soldiers inside it. The numbers come from scholarly estimates. Peter Heather of King's College London, whose work on the fall of the Roman Empire is among the most rigorous available, places Alaric's total force in this range. Bryan Ward-Perkins of Oxford University, whose 2005 book, The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, remains essential reading on this period, broadly concurs with these estimates. 30 to 40,000 armed men, moving through 13 square kilometers of densely packed urban space. Even spread across the entire city, that is an armed soldier for roughly every 15 to 20 civilians. Now let us start at the northeastern edge, at the Salarian Gate itself, and move through the city in the order that the Visigoth forces most likely moved. The area immediately inside the Salarian Gate was among the first to experience the full impact of entry. This neighborhood held some of Rome's most magnificent private residences. The gardens and mansion complex of the historian Sallust, built centuries earlier by the famous writer, expanded by subsequent owners, eventually absorbed into imperial property, occupied a vast area just inside the northeastern walls. The sources explicitly record that this complex burned. It is one of the most specifically documented acts of destruction from those 48 hours. Archaeological excavations in this area, particularly work conducted in the late 19th century when construction of the modern city began disturbing ancient layers, recovered evidence of severe fire damage dating to the early 5th century. Burned roof tiles, collapsed wall sections, carbonized wooden beams, the physical confirmation of what the written sources describe. From the Sallust gardens, the Visigoth advance moved in multiple directions simultaneously. This is crucial to understand. This was not a single column of soldiers marching down a single street. This was a force that spread through the urban grid, down the major arterial roads, along the aqueduct lines, toward the known concentrations of wealth and supply. One primary thrust moved southwest, down toward the Forum. The Roman Forum in 410 was still one of the most architecturally extraordinary spaces in the world. The temples, the basilicas, the triumphal arches, the Senate House, centuries of accumulated monumental construction layered on top of each other in a dense, gleaming mass of marble and bronze. The column of Trajan still stood, as it stands today. The Arch of Septimius Severus still marked the northwestern entrance to the Forum. The Temple of Saturn, which functioned as the Roman state treasury, stood on the slope of the Capitoline Hill, overlooking the Forum's western end. The Temple of Saturn was a primary target. Ancient sources indicate that the treasury it housed had been partially evacuated before the final siege. Officials loyal to Honorius had moved some imperial funds to Ravenna in the months preceding the sack. But not all of it. What remained was substantial, and the Visigoths knew it was there. The physical evidence from the Forum area shows a complex picture. Some structures show clear signs of damage and looting from this period. Others, remarkably, do not. The Curia Julia, the Senate House, survived relatively intact. The Arch of Titus survived. The column of Trajan was untouched. This selective pattern of damage and survival is one of the most interesting puzzles in the archaeology of this period. Bryan Ward-Perkins, examining the material evidence in detail, argues that what the archaeological record shows is consistent with targeted looting rather than general destruction. Soldiers taking what was portable and valuable, stripping metal fittings and decorative elements, but not engaging in the kind of systematic structural demolition that would leave a more uniformly catastrophic material signature. The great monuments survived. The portable wealth did not. Now move south from the Forum, down the slope of the Palatine, into the Circus Maximus Valley. The Circus Maximus, the enormous chariot racing stadium that could hold, according to ancient sources, up to 250,000 spectators, was not primarily a target for looting. There was little there to take, but it became, in those first hours, something unexpected. It became a gathering point. Roman citizens, thousands of them, converged on the open space of the circus in the early hours of the sack. The logic was straightforward and terrible. If soldiers are moving through the streets and through buildings, then open spaces might be safer. A crowd might offer anonymity. Being in a mass of people might make you less of a target than being alone in a house. We have no precise head count, no ancient census of the terrified people who crowded into the Circus Maximus on the morning of August 24th. But the sources suggest that open spaces throughout the city filled with people during those first hours. People who had fled their homes, people who had been driven out, people who simply did not know where else to go. This is one of the most human details of the entire 48 hours. 500,000 people, and many of them converging on open spaces, standing together in the August heat, listening to the sounds of the city being taken apart around them, not knowing if they were safer here or somewhere else, not knowing if the soldiers would come here next. Now cross the Tiber. The Trastevere neighborhood, literally across the Tiber, occupied the western bank of the river, connected to the main city by a series of bridges. It was a densely populated, working-class neighborhood, home to a large Jewish community, to Syrian and Egyptian merchants, to freed slaves and their descendants, to the kind of mixed, cosmopolitan urban population that Rome had always attracted and absorbed. The Trastevere experienced the sack differently from the neighborhoods on the eastern bank. The Visigoths crossed the Tiber. They moved into Trastevere. But the density of the neighborhood, its warren of narrow streets, its lack of the kind of concentrated wealth that made the Palatine and the Forum so attractive, all of this shaped what happened there. There was looting, there was violence, but the systematic, targeted stripping that characterized the assault on the great houses and imperial facilities was less organized here. The narrow streets broke up formations. The local population, many of them people who had never had much to begin with, had less to lose and perhaps fought back more readily when they had nothing left to protect. Across the Tiber bridges, the Pons Aemilius, the Pons Fabricius, the Pons Cestius, we can imagine a flow of people moving in both directions simultaneously. Soldiers moving west into Trastevere, civilians moving east trying to reach the churches on the main hills, or moving west trying to get across the river and out through the Aurelian walls into the countryside beyond. Because people were leaving the city. This is documented. The roads out of Rome, the Appian Way to the south, the Flaminian Way to the north, the Ostiense Road toward the port of Ostia, all of them were being used by people fleeing. Not en masse. The gates were controlled by Visigoth forces, but in the confusion, in the chaos of those first hours, people were getting out. Some of them walked to Ostia. Some walked to Naples. Some walked all the way to North Africa eventually, joining the stream of Roman refugees that Jerome was receiving in Bethlehem, that Augustine was encountering in Hippo Regius on the North African coast, that Orosius was observing throughout the Mediterranean world in the years that followed. These refugees carried something with them that we tend to overlook when we focus on material losses. They carried memory. Their accounts, filtered through the writers who recorded them, are part of the documentary record we have been examining throughout this investigation. These are the voices of people who were actually there, who saw it, who ran through it, who hid from it, who survived it and then walked, sometimes literally walked, hundreds of kilometers to tell someone what they had witnessed. And what did they say about those hours? Several recurring themes emerge from the refugee testimony that Jerome and others preserved. The first is the sound. Multiple accounts reference the noise of the sack, not as continuous roar, but as something that moved. Waves of sound that got louder and then softer as the focus of the looting shifted from neighborhood to neighborhood. People hiding in cellars described listening to the sounds overhead. Boots on floors, furniture being dragged, the crash of broken pottery, voices in an unfamiliar language, and trying to calculate from the sound alone how close the danger was. The second recurring theme is thirst and heat. August in Rome. The aqueducts were damaged or disrupted in the first hours, possibly deliberately, possibly as collateral damage of the entry. Without running water, a city of hundreds of thousands of people in high summer becomes desperate very quickly. The fountains stopped flowing. The baths went cold and empty. People who had been hiding for hours or who had fled to the open spaces of the circus or the churches had no water. Dehydration in extreme heat is not a slow process. For the elderly, for children, for anyone already weakened by the months of blockade, it could become life-threatening within hours. This is one of the details that tends to get lost in the grand historical narrative of the sack. We focus on the looting, on the political significance, on the theological response. We forget that it was also just physically unbearable. Hot, thirsty, frightened people crowded into spaces that offered no comfort, waiting for something they could not predict or control. The third recurring theme in the survivor accounts is perhaps the most psychologically revealing. Disbelief. Not fear, not rage, though those were present too, but a deeper, more fundamental disruption. The sense that the world had simply stopped making sense. Jerome captures it precisely when he writes that the refugees who came to him could barely speak, not because of physical injury, because they did not have the language for what they had witnessed. The categories of their understanding had broken down. Rome was supposed to be eternal. That was not a political slogan. That was a genuine, deeply held belief, embedded in religion, in culture, in the physical fabric of the city itself. The monuments, the temples, the inscriptions, everything in Rome told you that this city was forever. And then, in the space of a single night and the day that followed, forever ended. That psychological rupture, that collapse of the foundational narrative that an entire civilization had built its identity upon, is what makes those 48 hours so significant. Not just as a political event, not just as a military episode, but as a moment when an entire world had to confront the possibility that everything it believed about itself might be wrong. The people behind the walls. Who actually lived in Rome? We have been moving through the city geographically. Now we need to stop. We need to look at the people themselves. Because one of the greatest failures of traditional historical writing about the sack of Rome is its almost exclusive focus on the elite, on senators and emperors, on bishops and generals, on the wealthy, the famous, the theologically significant. But Rome in 410 was not a city of senators. It was a city of everyone else. And understanding those 48 hours, really understanding them, at the level of lived human experience, requires us to look at the full spectrum of people who were inside those walls when the gates opened. So let us do something unusual for a history of this period. Let us count. Let us categorize. Let us try to reconstruct, as precisely as the evidence allows, exactly who was in Rome on the night of August 23, 410. The demographic scholarship on late antique Rome is surprisingly rich. Historians, including Kyle Harper of the University of Oklahoma, whose work on Roman demography and disease has been groundbreaking, and Walter Scheidel of Stanford University, who has spent decades analyzing Roman population data, give us a framework for understanding who these people are. At the top of the social pyramid, and it was an extraordinarily steep pyramid, sat perhaps 2,000 senatorial families. The great aristocratic clans whose names fill the legal and literary sources of the period: the Anichii, the Symmachii, the Petronii. These were people of almost incomprehensible wealth by ancient standards. A senior senator's annual income from his rural estates could equal the annual pay of tens of thousands of ordinary soldiers. Their urban mansions, the ones that Visigoth soldiers were stripping in those 48 hours, were effectively small towns compressed into city blocks. Multiple courtyards, private bathhouses, libraries, gardens, staffed by dozens or hundreds of slaves and freed servants. Perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people in total lived at this level or close to it. Below them, a larger but still relatively small equestrian class, wealthy merchants, successful military officers, imperial administrators, perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 people. Below them, and this is where the numbers begin to explode, the vast middle and lower strata of Roman urban society. Small traders, artisans, bakers, butchers, tanners, potters, glassblowers, weavers, dyers. The people who made things and sold things and fixed things and moved things through the city every day. The evidence for this population is not in literary sources. Senators did not write about bakers. It is in the material record, in the excavated workshops along the Tiber, in the tools found in collapsed buildings, in the thousands of ceramic lamps, the iron hinges, the bone needles, the glass vessels that archaeology recovers from the lower strata of Roman urban sites. These people, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 of them, were the economic engine. And in those 48 hours, their workshops were being looted or destroyed. Their tools were being taken or smashed. Their carefully accumulated stock of materials and finished goods, the things they used to sustain themselves and their families, was disappearing. Below them, the urban poor, the recipients of the annona, the state grain dole that had been feeding Rome's poorest residents for centuries. By the early 5th century, the grain dole in Rome served perhaps 120,000 recipients, according to records analyzed by historians, including Peter Garnsey of Cambridge University. These were people who depended on the state distribution system for basic survival. When the Visigoths took the grain warehouses, as they did in the first hours, they cut off the food supply for 120,000 of the city's most vulnerable people. And then there were the slaves. This is the population that almost never appears in traditional accounts of the sack. And yet, they were everywhere, embedded in every level of Roman urban society, working in the senatorial mansions as domestic servants, tutors, cooks, secretaries, working in the workshops as skilled artisans. Many Roman craftsmen were enslaved, working in the warehouses, on the docks, in the bakeries that fed the city. Estimates of the slave population of late antique Rome vary considerably. Walter Scheidl's demographic work suggests that slaves may have constituted somewhere between 10 and 15% of the urban population in this period, meaning somewhere between 50,000 and 120,000 enslaved people inside the walls of Rome on the night the gates opened. Their experience of those 48 hours was unlike any other group in the city. For some of them, those attached to wealthy households that were being looted, the chaos represented something unexpected, an opportunity. Procopius, in his account of the sack, specifically mentions slaves as among those who opened the Salarian Gate for Alaric's forces. Whether or not this specific claim is accurate, it reflects a broader reality that the ancient sources acknowledge and that modern historians take seriously. For enslaved people in Rome, the arrival of the Visigoths was not straightforwardly terrifying in the way it was for their owners. Some ran. Some joined the Visigoth forces. Some simply disappeared into the chaos. And in the subsequent decades, Roman law codes contain numerous provisions attempting to force the return of slaves who had escaped during the sack, suggesting that significant numbers successfully used the disorder to free themselves. This is a dimension of those 48 hours that rarely appears in the standard narrative. While senators were mourning the loss of their silver plate and their ancestral portraits, while bishops were writing theological treatises about the meaning of Rome's fall, tens of thousands of enslaved people were experiencing those same hours as, in some cases, the moment of their liberation. History is never a single story. Now consider another population that the sources largely ignore: the children. Rome in 410 had a very young population by modern standards. Roman demography, as analyzed by scholars including Tim Parkin of the University of Manchester, suggests that children under 15 may have constituted 30 to 40% of the urban population. The death rate was high. The birth rate had to be high to compensate. In a city of 500,000 to 800,000 people, that means somewhere between 150,000 and 320,000 children. What happened to them in those 48 hours? The sources are almost entirely silent on this question. We get the occasional reference: Jerome's anguished accounts of families separated in the chaos, Augustine's theological wrestling with the suffering of the innocent, a handful of legal documents from the years after the sack dealing with orphaned children whose parents died during or immediately after the events of August 410. But the children themselves are nearly invisible in the historical record. They left no letters. They wrote no theological treatises. The refugees whose accounts Jerome preserved were adults, or remembered events as adults, remembering childhood trauma from a distance. What we can reconstruct, using what we know about urban conflict and civilian experience in ancient warfare, is this: children would have experienced those 48 hours primarily through the responses of the adults around them. Hidden under beds, pushed into cellars, carried through streets, pressed against their parents and the dense crowds at the churches. The terror they felt was real. Neurological research on trauma tells us that the developing brain is particularly vulnerable to the kind of overwhelming sensory experience that a sack produces. The sounds, the smells, the disruption of every familiar routine and source of security. There would have been children in Rome in August 410 who never fully recovered from those 48 hours, who carried the sensory memory of that night in their bodies for the rest of their lives. We will never know their names. Their stories are buried with them somewhere under the streets of modern Rome. Now let us consider the religious geography of the city's population, because by 410, Rome was in a profound state of religious transition that shaped the experience of the sack in ways that are not immediately obvious. The city was officially Christian. The Emperor Theodosius had made Christianity the sole legal religion of the empire in 380. The great pagan temples were officially closed, though in practice, in Rome, traditional religion persisted stubbornly among certain aristocratic families. But Christianity in 410 Rome was not a single unified thing. There were Orthodox Christians following the Nicene Creed established at the Council of Nicaea in 325. There were Arian Christians, the same theological tradition as Alaric himself, who had different views on the nature of Christ. There were Donatists, Manichaeans, Pelagians. The theological controversies of the early church were very much alive and actively contested in 410. And there were pagans. Particularly among the old senatorial families, the traditional Roman religion, the worship of Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, the household gods, the ancestral spirits, had never entirely died. It had gone underground, had become private, had continued in domestic ritual even as public practice was banned. These families would later argue, and Augustine specifically records and refutes this argument, that Rome fell because it had abandoned the old gods, that the protection of Jupiter had been withdrawn when the temples were closed. This religious fracture shaped the experience of those 48 hours in very concrete ways. For Orthodox Christians, the churches offered refuge, and Alaric's orders regarding church sanctuary meant that refuge was real, if imperfect. Their bishops were present, their community structures were intact, their theological framework gave them a context, however anguished, for understanding what was happening. For pagans, the situation was more exposed. The temples were officially closed. There was no pagan equivalent of the church sanctuary. The theological community that might have offered meaning and framework had been legally suppressed for 30 years. And in those 48 hours, pagan Romans experienced not just the physical terror of the sack, but the additional psychological burden of facing it without institutional support. The Jewish community of Rome, concentrated primarily in Trastevere, one of the oldest Jewish communities in the Western diaspora, present in Rome since at least the 2nd century before the Common Era, experienced the sack within its own communal framework. The synagogues offered gathering points. The tight community networks that diaspora existence had always demanded meant that information moved quickly, and mutual aid organized itself more rapidly than in the surrounding Roman population. Whether the Jewish community's experience was better or worse than their neighbors is impossible to say with confidence. The sources that might tell us are almost entirely absent. What we can say is that it was different, shaped by different institutions, different traditions, different relationships to the Roman state and to Roman civic identity. All of these people, senators, slaves, children, pagans, Christians, Jews, merchants, bakers, soldiers, priests, were inside the same walls during the same 48 hours. But they were not having the same experience. They were having hundreds of thousands of different experiences, filtered through their social position, their religious identity, their neighborhood, their age, their physical strength, their luck. History tends to flatten that multiplicity into a single narrative. Rome fell. Rome was sacked. Rome suffered. But 500,000 individual human beings did not suffer a single unified experience. They each lived through their own version of those 48 hours. They each made decisions to hide or to run, to resist or to comply, to help a neighbor or to abandon them, to pray or to curse, or simply to hold their children and wait. And almost all of those individual stories are lost. What we have are fragments, glimpses, the edge of a vast human reality that the historical record can only partially recover. But those fragments are enough to tell us something important, something that the grand political narrative of Roman decline tends to obscure. The fall of Rome was not primarily a political event. It was not primarily a military event. It was not primarily a theological event, though Augustine worked very hard to make it one. It was a human event. It happened to people, specific, individual, irreplaceable people. And in the next chapter, we are going to look at what those people did in the hours after the initial shock, as the 48 hours stretched on, as the reality of what was happening became undeniable, and as Rome's population began to make decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. The second day: survival, adaptation, and the will to live. By the morning of August 25th, something had shifted. Not the danger. The danger was still everywhere. Visigoth soldiers were still moving through the city. The looting was still ongoing. The smoke from burning buildings was still rising over the rooftops. The sounds of the sack were still audible from every neighborhood inside the walls. But something fundamental had changed in the psychology of the city's population. The first hours had been pure shock, pure reaction, the freeze response, the paralysis of the incomprehensible. The second day was different. The second day was about survival. Active, deliberate, determined survival. And what the sources show us, fragmentary as they are, is that the people of Rome were far more resourceful, far more organized, and far more resilient in those hours than the grand narrative of civilizational collapse tends to suggest. Let us start with the churches. By the morning of August 25th, the major basilicas of Rome had been transformed into something the ancient world had no precise word for. Not temples, not hospitals, not refuges. Something that combined elements of all three. The Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. Standing beyond the Aurelian walls along the Ostiense road, technically outside the main circuit of the city, had filled with people overnight. The sources suggest that Alaric's protection order extended even here, to this basilica standing outside the walls themselves. People had walked through the darkness, through the chaos of the first hours, following the road south from the city to reach this building. Inside the great Roman basilicas, structures that were, we should remember, enormous. The Basilica of St. Paul was one of the largest buildings in the ancient world, capable of holding thousands of people under its vast nave. A new social order was forming with extraordinary speed. The bishops and their clergy were not passive. This is important. The Roman Church in 410 was not yet the fully developed institutional structure it would become in later centuries, but it had infrastructure. It had networks. It had experienced administrators, deacons and subdeacons whose job in normal times included managing the distribution of charity to the city's poor, coordinating the food supplies that wealthy donors gave to the church for redistribution, maintaining the registers of widows and orphans who depended on church support. These were the people who stepped forward in those 48 hours. They organized the space. They allocated areas for the injured. They managed the distribution of whatever food and water existed inside the church buildings. They kept order, not through force, but through the authority that their institutional role gave them within a population that was overwhelmingly Christian, and therefore disposed to recognize that authority even in extremis. This is one of the most significant and most underappreciated aspects of those 48 hours. The institutional Church of Rome performed in those hours a function that the imperial state had entirely abandoned. The emperor was in Ravenna. The military was absent. The civil administration had collapsed or fled. The Senate, many of whose members had escaped the city weeks or months earlier when the final siege began, was not present to organize a response. But the deacons were there. The priests were there. The bishop's representatives were there. And they were doing something. In a city where every familiar structure of authority had either fled or been overwhelmed, the church was the only functioning institution left. Augustine would later theologize this reality into an argument about the city of God versus the city of man, arguing that earthly cities and earthly empires are always temporary, always fragile, while the community of the faithful endures. But before it was theology, it was simply the lived reality of those 48 hours, the human institution that survived when everything else collapsed. Now let us move outside the churches, back into the streets, because not everyone was in a church. The majority of Rome's population was not in a church. What were they doing on the morning of August 25th? The evidence suggests several distinct patterns of behavior emerging simultaneously. The first pattern was negotiation. Romans, particularly Romans of the middle classes, the merchants and skilled artisans and small property owners who had something to lose but were not wealthy enough to attract the focused attention of the organized looting, were negotiating with individual Visigoth soldiers. This sounds surprising, but it is consistent with the nature of what was happening. Alaric's force was not a unified machine executing a precisely coordinated plan. It was tens of thousands of individual soldiers operating with general orders but enormous individual discretion at the street level. A Visigoth soldier standing in front of a bakery, or a workshop, or a modest private home was making individual decisions. Take everything. Take some things. Accept an offer. Move on. And Romans who kept their heads, who did not panic, who could communicate, who had something to offer, discovered that negotiation was possible. What did they offer? Whatever they had. Small amounts of coin hidden in clothing, food, wine, information about where more valuable things might be found, the surrender of one thing to protect another. This kind of micro-level negotiation is almost entirely invisible in the written sources. Senators did not write about it. It was beneath their dignity. Bishops did not record it. It did not fit the theological narrative they were constructing. But it happened. It must have happened, given what we know about the character of urban military occupation and the documented fact that large numbers of ordinary Romans survived those 48 hours with at least some of their property and persons intact. The second pattern was mutual aid. This is also largely invisible in the formal sources, but it emerges in fragments. Jerome's refugee accounts include references to neighbors helping neighbors, to people sharing food and water with strangers in the churches, to individuals guiding the elderly or injured through streets they knew, towards safety they had identified. The dense social networks of Roman urban life, the neighborhood associations, the guild organizations, the informal community structures that existed in every Roman city did not simply dissolve when the gates opened. They contracted. They became hyper-local, but they continued to function. In the apartment blocks of the Subura, in the workshop districts along the Tiber, in the market areas of the Velabrum Valley, people who had been neighbors for years or decades were making collective decisions, pooling resources, sharing information, deciding together whether to stay or to move, where the danger was and where it was not. This is what human communities do under extreme stress. They do not simply atomize into isolated individuals. They cluster. They cooperate. They share. The third pattern, and this one is documented in the sources, was opportunism. Not everyone in Rome during those 48 hours was a victim. Some Romans used the chaos for their own purposes. There are references in subsequent legal documents. The legal codes of the 5th century contain numerous provisions that clearly respond to events during the sack, to Romans who used the disorder to settle old scores, to seize property they had long coveted, to denounce enemies to the Visigoth soldiers as holders of hidden wealth, to disappear debts by ensuring that the creditor did not survive. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is a true one. Every major urban catastrophe in history produces this phenomenon. The breakdown of normal legal order creates for some an opportunity. The sack of Rome was no different. Among the hundreds of thousands of frightened, suffering people in those streets, there were also people who recognized the moment and used it. The legal chaos that followed the sack, and it was substantial, filling the law courts of the Western Empire for years afterward, reflects this reality. Questions of property ownership, inheritance, the validity of transactions made under duress, the status of agreements entered into during the sack. All of this had to be untangled in the years that followed, and the legal record preserves fragments of stories that the literary sources do not. Now, let us consider something that the second day brought, which the first day had not. Information. By the morning of August 25th, the population of Rome had had approximately 12 to 15 hours to begin processing what was happening. And in that time, information was moving through the city in the way that information always moves through dense urban populations. Person to person, block to block, through the networks of human connection that exist in any living city. Some of this information was accurate. The churches are safe. The Basilica of St. Peter is protected. The soldiers on the Aventine are moving north. The warehouses by the river have been emptied. Do not go there looking for food. Some of it was rumor, fear, and distortion. The entire Palatine is on fire. The Tiber bridges have been destroyed. Alaric has ordered the killing of all adult men. All of this circulating through the population. Impossible to verify. Each piece of information shaping decisions that could mean life or death. The management of information, or more precisely, the desperate attempt to find reliable information in a situation where no reliable information existed, was one of the central challenges of those 48 hours for every person inside the walls. This is another aspect of the experience that modern historical narratives miss almost entirely. We know, with the comfortable retrospective certainty of 1,500 years of subsequent scholarship, what was happening and why. We know Alaric's orders. We know the duration of the sack. We know how it ended. The people inside Rome knew none of this. They knew only what they could see from their window, what they heard from the person who had just run past their door, what they could infer from the sounds and smells of the city around them. They were making life and death decisions on the basis of radically incomplete, constantly changing, deeply unreliable information. That uncertainty, that fundamental not knowing, was itself a form of suffering. As the second day wore on, another development was shaping the experience of those inside the walls. The Visigoth forces were beginning to consolidate. The initial, somewhat diffuse spread of soldiers through the city's neighborhoods was giving way to a more organized pattern. Collection points were being established, places where looted goods were being gathered and sorted. The military logistics of moving enormous quantities of plunder were becoming apparent. Wagons were being loaded. Animals were being corralled. Alaric was preparing to leave. This was not yet apparent to most of the city's population, but the change in the character of Visigoth activity, from active looting to consolidation, meant that the random, unpredictable violence of the first hours was beginning to give way to something more structured, which meant, paradoxically, that in some parts of the city, it was becoming marginally safer to move. Not safe, not remotely safe, but the calculus was shifting, and some Romans began to move, not to flee the city, the gates were still controlled, but to move within it, to check on family members in other neighborhoods, to find water, to locate food, to discover with a kind of desperate relief that someone they had feared dead was in fact alive and hiding 3 streets away. These reunions, family members finding each other in the ruins of the normal city, are among the most human moments of those 48 hours, and they are almost completely absent from the historical record, because the people they happened to were not writers, were not theologically significant, were not members of the senatorial class whose experiences the sources tend to preserve. They happened. We cannot doubt that they happened. But they happened in silence, below the threshold of historical visibility. The second day was also when the scale of the food and water crisis became impossible to ignore. The aqueducts, Rome's extraordinary hydraulic infrastructure, the system of channels and pipes and fountains that had supplied the city with fresh running water for centuries, were severely disrupted. Whether this was deliberate Visigoth action or simply the inevitable consequence of the breakdown of the complex maintenance system that kept the aqueducts functioning, the result was the same. The fountains were dry. The public baths were closed and empty. The elaborate water distribution network that had made Rome's extraordinary population density possible had stopped working. In August heat, for a population already weakened by months of blockade, with the grain warehouses emptied and the food doles suspended, the suffering this caused was not dramatic in the way that violence is dramatic. It did not produce the kind of vivid, quotable accounts that fill the literary sources. But it was real, and it was widespread, and it affected every single person in the city, regardless of their social position, their religious identity, their neighborhood. A senator dying of thirst and a slave dying of thirst are dying the same death. And somewhere in Rome, on the second day of the sack, both were happening. But here is what is also true. People were surviving. In extraordinary numbers given the circumstances, people were surviving. The population that had seemed so exposed, so vulnerable, so abandoned, was proving more resilient than the catastrophe demanded. And that resilience, that stubborn, unglamorous, untheologized human will to continue existing, is perhaps the most important thing that happened in those 48 hours. Not the looting, not the theological crisis, not the political aftermath, but the fact that when the Visigoths finally marched out of Rome on approximately August 27th, 3 days after they had entered, the city was still full of people. Damaged, traumatized, stripped of wealth and certainty and the foundational belief in Roman eternal permanence, but alive, still there, still Rome. After the storm, when the Visigoths left and Rome counted its dead, on approximately August 27th, 410, the Visigoths marched out of Rome, 3 days after they had entered. They left through the southern gates, moving down toward Campania, toward the heel of Italy, loaded with the accumulated wealth of the greatest city in the Western world. Wagons, pack animals, columns of soldiers carrying bundles of looted goods, and among them, walking not as prisoners exactly, but not as free people either, a significant number of Romans. Hostages, high-value captives whose families might pay ransom, skilled workers whose abilities Alaric's forces wanted to retain, and some who simply had no reason to stay. The last Visigoth soldier passed through the gates of Rome, and then silence. A different silence from the silence of hiding, not the silence of dread and suspended breath, the silence of aftermath, the silence of a city that has survived something it did not believe it could survive, standing in the wreckage of itself, trying to understand what comes next. What did Rome look like in those first hours after the Visigoths left? The archaeological evidence gives us one kind of answer. The written sources give us another. And together they paint a picture that is both more devastating and more remarkable than most accounts suggest. Let us start with the physical city. The destruction, while severe in specific locations, was not total. This is a finding that surprises many people. The popular image of the sack of Rome, derived partly from later artistic representations, partly from the rhetorical anguish of writers like Jerome, partly from the political use that various parties made of the event in subsequent decades, tends toward an image of comprehensive devastation. A city reduced to ruins, smoking rubble from wall to wall. The archaeological record does not support this picture. What it shows instead is something more complex and, in some ways, more interesting. Specific areas of concentrated destruction. The neighborhood around the Salarian Gate, burned and severely damaged. The Sallust Gardens complex, substantially destroyed. Certain aristocratic mansions on the Aventine and Palatine, stripped and in some cases burned. Sections of the warehouse district along the Tiber, gutted. But the majority of the city's physical fabric was intact. The great monuments of the Forum survived. The Colosseum was untouched. The Pantheon, that extraordinary domed temple to all the gods, completed under Hadrian in the 2nd century, stood exactly as it had stood before. The aqueduct structures, while disrupted in their function, were not demolished. The Aurelian walls were intact. The insulae, the apartment blocks housing the bulk of the population, were largely standing, damaged in places, looted of anything portable, but structurally present. Rome was wounded. Rome was not rubble. Kathleen Shelton, among other art historians who have studied the material culture of this period, notes that the continuity of Roman artistic production in the years immediately following 410 suggests that the city's craftsmen and workshops, while disrupted, were not eliminated. Within years, not decades, but years, Roman workshops were producing again. Roman artisans were working again. The physical infrastructure of production, while damaged, had not been destroyed beyond recovery. This matters enormously for understanding what happened in the days and weeks after the Visigoths left, because a city whose physical fabric is largely intact is a city that can be re-inhabited, a city that can begin to function again, a city whose population, traumatized and depleted as it was, had something to return to. But return to what exactly? Let us walk through the city again, this time in the hours after the departure. The first thing that Romans emerging from their hiding places, their churches, their cellars, would have encountered was the 3 days of urban occupation by a large military force in August heat, without functioning sewage or water systems. The smell of Rome in the immediate aftermath would have been extraordinary. Human waste, animal waste, the smell of fires, some still smoldering, the smell of rotting food from warehouses that had been broken open and partially emptied, the smell of blood from locations where violence had occurred. Smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotion in human neurology. The smell of Rome on August 27, 410, would have been burned into the memory of every person who experienced it. It would have followed them for the rest of their lives. After the smell, the visual reality of the stripped city. The statues were gone. Not all of them. The great stone and marble monuments were too heavy to move easily. But the bronze statues, and Rome had thousands of them, centuries of accumulated honorific sculpture in the metal that was most valuable to a moving army, were largely gone, melted down or carried off. The decorative metal fittings from temples and public buildings, gone. The roof tiles of gilded bronze that had covered certain imperial structures, gone. Rome still had its bones, its stone and brick and concrete and marble, but its skin, the decorative, portable, metallic layer of wealth that had made it glitter, had been stripped away. The Roman writer Rutilius Nemesianus, traveling through Italy in 417, just 7 years after the sack, wrote a poem called De Reditu Suo, On His Return, that describes the landscape of post-sack Italy. It is one of our most valuable near-contemporary accounts of the immediate aftermath. He describes roads damaged, rural estates abandoned, a landscape that feels emptied and uncertain. But he also describes Rome itself as still present, still functioning, still the center of the world in some essential way. Battered, but not. This duality, the reality of severe damage alongside the stubborn persistence of the city as a living entity, is the key to understanding what came next. Because what came next was not the end. It was a beginning. A terrible, painful, uncertain beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. In those first hours after the Visigoths left, the most urgent practical crisis was water. The aqueducts needed to be restored. And here, one of the most remarkable facts of the immediate aftermath emerges. The technical knowledge required to maintain and restore Rome's aqueduct system had not left with the Visigoths. The engineers, the workers, the curatores aquarum, the officials responsible for the water supply, were still in the city. Some of them had been hiding for 3 days. Some had sheltered in churches. Some had spent those days listening to the water stop flowing and calculating what it would take to make it flow again. Within days of the Visigoth departure, work began on restoring the water supply. This is documented in administrative records from the period analyzed by historians including Richard Coates Stevens, who has written extensively on the post-classical history of Rome's aqueducts. The restoration was not immediate. It was not complete. Some sections of the aqueduct system that were damaged in 410 were never fully repaired. But the attempt began almost immediately. That fact, that within days of the sack, Roman engineers were back at work on the aqueducts, tells us something profound about the resilience of the city's institutional and technical knowledge. The Visigoths had taken the gold. They had not taken the expertise. Now let us look at the human cost. How many people died in those 48 hours? This is a question that the sources do not answer directly, and that historians have wrestled with for a very long time. The written sources are not helpful in terms of precise. Jerome writes of widespread death, but does not enumerate. Orosius, who had a specific theological argument to make about the relative mildness of the sack compared to earlier Roman catastrophes, actively argues that the death toll was limited. Augustine does not provide numbers. The archaeological evidence gives us indirect indicators rather than body counts. What we can say based on careful analysis of burial records from the period, demographic modeling, and the evidence of subsequent population levels is this. The direct death toll from violence during the 3 days of the sack was almost certainly in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands. This is consistent with the character of the sack as documented, targeted rather than indiscriminate, with significant portions of the population protected by church sanctuary or simply not encountered by soldiers focused on wealthier targets. But the indirect death toll, the people who died in the weeks and months following the sack from injuries, from starvation, from the collapse of the food supply system, from disease in a city whose sanitation had been severely disrupted, from the psychological trauma of what they had experienced, that number is harder to calculate, and almost certainly significantly higher. Kyle Harper's work on disease and mortality in the Roman world is relevant here. A major disruption to urban sanitation and water supply in a densely populated ancient city was not a minor event. The disruption of the grain dole, even temporarily, could produce cascading mortality among the most vulnerable populations. The elderly, the very young, those already weakened by months of blockade. They would have died in elevated numbers in the weeks after the sack, and their deaths would not appear in any source as casualties of the event itself. The total human cost of those 48 hours, properly calculated to include all subsequent mortality attributable to the disruption, was probably very high. Tens of thousands over the subsequent months, in a city that may have already lost population during the years of preceding crisis. But let us return to those immediate hours after the departure, because something else was happening simultaneously with the practical work of survival and restoration. something was happening in the minds and hearts of the people who remained. The psychological aftermath of those 48 hours was in some ways more consequential than the physical damage. We have a remarkable document that lets us glimpse this psychological reality directly. Paulinus of Nola was a Roman aristocrat turned Christian bishop living in the town of Nola south of Rome. He survived the sack. In the months that followed, he wrote letters that have been preserved, that scholars have analyzed carefully, that give us an extraordinarily intimate window into the mental world of a Roman Christian in the immediate aftermath of the event. Paulinus describes something that modern psychologists would recognize immediately as acute stress response: the inability to sleep, the intrusive return of sensory memories, sounds, smells, images that kept breaking into waking consciousness, the difficulty of making decisions that had previously been simple, the sense that the world had become fundamentally unreliable, that the ground beneath ordinary life was no longer solid. He also describes something else, something that sits alongside the trauma: a strange clarity. The things that had seemed important before, wealth, status, the accumulated possessions of a Roman aristocratic life, had revealed themselves in those 48 hours as weightless, transient, taken in an afternoon. And what had remained? The relationships, the faith, the knowledge that you and the people you loved were still breathing. Those things had revealed themselves as the only things that had ever mattered. This psychological reorientation, this forced confrontation with what is actually essential, was happening not just in Paulinus, but across the surviving population of Rome in those weeks and months. It was this reorientation, this collective psychological shift, that Augustine was trying to capture and theologize in The City of God. He was not writing in an abstract philosophical vacuum. He was responding to a real, shared, collective experience of disillusionment, the discovery that the eternal city was not eternal, that the empire was not forever, that all the marble and bronze and accumulated centuries of Roman greatness could be stripped away in 3 days. His argument, that the true city, the city worth belonging to, was not Rome, but the community of the faithful, resonated so powerfully across the Christian world precisely because it gave theological form to something that hundreds of thousands of people had just experienced in their bodies and their lives. But we should be careful not to let Augustine's theological brilliance obscure the human reality beneath it. The people of Rome in the weeks after the sack were not primarily engaged in theological reflection. They were trying to find food. They were trying to find clean water. They were trying to locate family members from whom they had been separated. They were trying to assess what remained of their homes, their workshops, their accumulated material existence. They were trying, in the most basic and unglamorous sense, to figure out how to live in the city that remained after 3 days of occupation had taken away so much of what had made it what it was. And most of them, this is the fact that history tends to forget, succeeded. They stayed. They rebuilt. They adapted. The population of Rome declined in the years and decades after 410. That is documented. That is real. But the city did not empty. It did not become a ruin. It did not stop being Rome. People who had watched the Visigoths march out of the gates on August 27th went back to their workshops the following week, reopened their stalls, began to reconstruct what had been taken or destroyed, sent word to family members who had fled, began the slow, painful, unglamorous work of continuing. Because that is what people do. Not because they are heroic, not because they are remarkable, but because the alternative stopping, collapsing, ceasing to try, is not in the nature of the living. Rome survived those 48 hours. Not triumphantly, not without devastating loss, not without scars that would never entirely heal. But it survived. And in that survival, in the stubborn, ordinary, unrecorded survival of hundreds of thousands of individual human beings, lies the most important truth about what happened when Rome fell. The city was eternal after all, not in the way the propaganda claimed, not in marble and bronze and imperial power, but in the way that human communities are always eternal, in the refusal, repeated across every generation and every catastrophe, to simply stop. What Rome's fall teaches us, the final reckoning. We have walked through those 48 hours together. We have stood at the Salarian gate as it opened in the darkness. We have moved through the streets with the terrified and the hiding and the desperate. We have sat in the basilicas with the refugees and the clergy organizing survival from nothing. We have watched the Visigoths consolidate their plunder and finally march south. We have seen the city emerge, blinking and wounded, into the silence of the aftermath. Now it is time to step back, to look at the full picture, to ask the questions that those 48 hours force us to ask, about civilization, about resilience, about what we actually mean when we say that something falls. Because the sack of Rome in 410 is one of those historical events that every generation reinterprets through the lens of its own anxieties and preoccupations. And understanding why it has been interpreted so differently, and what the most current scholarship actually tells us, is as important as understanding what happened in the streets. Let us begin with the question that has haunted this story from the beginning. Did Rome actually fall in 410? The answer, it turns out, depends entirely on what you mean by the word fall. If you mean, did the physical city cease to exist? The answer is clearly no. Rome continued to be inhabited, continued to function, continued to be the seat of the Western Roman papacy, which was becoming an increasingly significant institution, continued to attract pilgrims, merchants, scholars, and migrants from across the Mediterranean world. If you mean, did the Western Roman Empire collapse in 410? Again, no. The Western Empire continued for another 66 years until the deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476. That date, 476, is the one that traditional historiography has used as the formal end of the Western Roman Empire, though modern historians increasingly question whether any single date can capture a process that unfolded across centuries. If you mean, did something fundamental and irreversible happen to Roman civilization in 410? Something that changed the trajectory of the ancient world in ways that could never be undone? Then the answer is yes. Unambiguously, yes. But the nature of that change is more subtle and more interesting than the simple narrative of collapse suggests. Peter Heather, in his 2006 book, The Fall of the Roman Empire, argues that the sack of 410 was a critical psychological turning point, not because of what it destroyed physically, but because of what it destroyed conceptually. The belief in Roman invincibility, the foundational assumption that the empire would endure. Once that belief was broken, once it had been demonstrated in the most visceral and undeniable way possible that Rome could be taken, the political and military calculations of every player in the late antique world shifted. Barbarian leaders who had previously operated within the Roman system, seeking Roman titles, Roman land grants, Roman legitimacy, began to calculate differently. If Rome itself could be sacked, then what exactly were they seeking Roman approval for? Bryan Ward-Perkins, whose work we have referenced throughout this investigation, takes a more materially focused view. He argues, controversially, against a significant strand of scholarship that emphasizes cultural continuity across the fall of the Western Empire, that the archaeological evidence shows a genuine, severe, and long-lasting decline in material living standards across the former Western Roman territories in the 5th and 6th centuries. Not just a political transition, not just a change of who was in charge, but a real deterioration in the complexity and quality of everyday material life. The ceramic evidence is particularly striking. Roman fine-ware pottery, standardized, wheel-thrown, widely traded, appears consistently across the archaeological record of the Western Empire throughout the first 4 centuries of the Common Era. After the mid-5th century, it becomes dramatically rarer in the West. What replaces it is coarser, more locally produced, less standardized. The trading networks that had carried pottery and grain and oil and wine and the 1,000 other commodities of Roman commercial life were breaking down. Ward-Perkins sees this as evidence of genuine civilizational regression, a real loss of complexity, a real decline in the material conditions of ordinary life. Not everyone agrees. Walter Goffard, Guy Halsall, and other historians associated with what is sometimes called the accommodation school of late antique studies argue that the transition from Roman to post-Roman society in the West was more gradual, more negotiated, and less catastrophic than Ward-Perkins suggests. They point to cultural continuities, the persistence of Latin as a learned language, the survival of Roman legal traditions, the continuation of Roman administrative forms under barbarian kings, as evidence that what happened was transformation rather than collapse. This debate is genuinely unresolved. It is one of the most active and productive arguments in contemporary ancient history, and both sides have evidence. The truth, as is usually the case in complex historical questions, probably lies in the acknowledgement that both things were simultaneously true, that there were real continuities and real losses, and that the balance between them varied enormously depending on where you were, who you were, and what aspect of Roman life you are measuring. But for our purposes, for the question of those 48 hours and their significance, what matters most is this. 410 was the moment when the abstract became concrete. Romans had known intellectually that the empire was in trouble. The political chaos of the 3rd century, the military pressures on the frontiers, the economic disruptions of the 4th century, the theological controversies that had riven the church and the state simultaneously, the increasing dependence on barbarian military forces, the effective abandonment of the western frontiers in certain areas. All of this was known. All of this was discussed, debated, lamented. But it was known in the way that we know about things that are happening at a distance. Abstractly, with a comfortable sense that the center would hold, that Rome would manage, that it always had before. August 410 made it physical, made it sensory, made it undeniable. And once something has been made undeniable, human behavior changes. The decades after 410 saw an acceleration of processes that had already been underway, but that acceleration was real and consequential. More aristocratic families relocated from Rome to their rural estates, or to the eastern Mediterranean, or to North Africa. More imperial resources were directed away from the city of Rome itself toward the more defensible and strategically useful Ravenna. More barbarian leaders began to operate as effectively independent rulers within former Roman territory, while maintaining the formal fiction of Roman suzerainty. The center of gravity of the Western world began, slowly and then faster, to shift. And Rome, the physical city, the million-person metropolis, began the long demographic decline that would eventually reduce it, by the early medieval period, to a city of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 people. Cattle grazed in the forum. The aqueducts fell silent one by one. The great monuments stood not as the backdrop to a living civilization, but as the ruins of something that the medieval Romans who lived among them could barely comprehend. The population decline was not sudden. It took generations, but it began in earnest after 410, and the 48 hours we have been investigating were the pivot point. Now let us return to the question we opened with. What happened to 1 million people overnight? Having followed the evidence through 8 chapters of investigation, we can now offer the most complete answer that the historical and archaeological record allows. Approximately 500,000 to 800,000 people experienced those 48 hours. The range reflects genuine uncertainty in the demographic estimates, not evasion. The majority survived the sack itself. This is a fact that the sources, despite their rhetorical anguish, consistently support. The character of the Visigoth occupation, targeted rather than indiscriminate, with explicit orders protecting church sanctuary, meant that mass killing of the civilian population did not occur. But survival of the event did not mean survival of its consequences. In the weeks and months following August 410, Rome's population declined significantly. Some fled. The refugee streams documented by Jerome and others were real and substantial. Some died from the indirect consequences of the sack, the disruption of food supplies, the breakdown of sanitation, the diseases that follow in the wake of urban catastrophe. Some simply did not return to a city that no longer felt like the center of a stable world. The population of Rome, which had stood at perhaps 500,000 to 800,000 in 410, probably fell to somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 within a generation. Not from the violence of those 48 hours, but from the sustained consequences of what those hours had set in motion. This distinction matters. The sack of Rome did not kill most of Rome's people. What it killed was Rome's future as a city of that scale and complexity. And for the people who lived through those 48 hours, who hid in their cellars, who ran to the churches, who negotiated with soldiers, who helped their neighbors, who buried their valuables under their floors, who emerged blinking into the silence of August 27th and began the work of continuing, that distinction would have felt cold comfort indeed. They had survived, but the world they had survived into was not the world they had known before. Let us end with some open questions. Because honest historical investigation does not always produce clean answers, and the events of 410 still contain mysteries that scholarship has not resolved. The first open question concerns Alaric himself. He died within months of the sack. In late 410, moving through southern Italy, he fell ill. The sources do not specify from what, and died near the town of Cosenza in Calabria. He was buried, according to the famous account preserved by Jordanes, in the bed of the Bucento River, which was temporarily diverted to allow his burial and then redirected to cover the grave. His burial place has never been found. The man who sacked Rome, who changed the course of Western history, whose decision to enter through the Salarian Gate on August 24th set everything in motion. His remains lie somewhere in a riverbed in southern Italy, unlocated and uncelebrated, 600 years before the concept of archaeological excavation existed. What drove him? What did he actually want? The sources show us a man who tried repeatedly to negotiate, who sought land, military command, recognition within the Roman system, and who turned to violence only when those negotiations repeatedly failed. Was the sack of Rome something he wanted, or something he felt forced into by the intransigence of Honorius? That question remains genuinely open. The second open question concerns the Visigoth noble hostage who changes everything. Galla Placidia was the daughter of the Emperor Theodosius and the half-sister of Honorius. She was in Rome during the sack and was taken by the Visigoths, not as a prisoner in the brutal sense, but as a high-value hostage, treated with the respect due her imperial status. She traveled with the Visigoth forces through Italy and then into Gaul. She eventually married Alaric's successor. She became, in the most extraordinary personal trajectory of the post-sack period, the mother of a Western Roman emperor and one of the most powerful women in the late antique world. Her experience of those 48 hours, an imperial princess watching the city of her dynasty being looted by the forces that would soon become her family, is one of the most remarkable untold stories of the entire period. She left no direct account. What she thought, what she felt, what she understood in those hours, we cannot know. The third open question is the one that perhaps matters most for how we understand this story. Why do we still care? 1,516 years have passed since those 48 hours. Every person who lived through them is long dead. The city that exists on the same ground today, modern Rome, a city of nearly 3 million people, one of the great metropolises of contemporary Europe, has no direct, unbroken continuity with the Rome of 410. It is built on its ruins. It carries its name. It contains its monuments, but it is not the same city. So why does it matter? Why have generations of historians, theologians, philosophers, and ordinary curious people returned to this event again and again across 15 centuries? The answer, I think, has something to do with what those 48 hours reveal about the relationship between civilization and fragility. We build, we accumulate, we create systems of extraordinary complexity, systems that supply water to millions of people, that distribute food, that maintain order, that allow the dense concentration of human beings in urban space that makes civilization possible. We build these systems over generations, over centuries. We come to depend on them so completely that we forget they are systems, that they require constant maintenance, constant political will, constant collective investment to And then something happens. A political failure, a military defeat, a natural disaster, a pandemic that disrupts the systems. And we discover with a shock that each generation seems to experience as if for the first time, that the systems are not permanent, that the complexity is fragile, that what took centuries to build can be disrupted in days. That is the lesson of those 48 hours. Not that Rome was uniquely weak or uniquely corrupt, or that its fall was inevitable or deserved. Not that barbarians are dangerous or that empires always collapse. Not any of the simple moralizing lessons that various political and theological traditions have tried to extract from the event across 15 centuries. But this: complex human societies are always more fragile than they appear from inside them. And the people living inside them, the people going about their ordinary lives, buying bread and arguing with neighbors and worrying about their children and making plans for next year, are always the last to see the fragility clearly. Until the gates open, until the sounds begin, until the water stops flowing and the food runs out, and the emperor is somewhere else, and the army is not coming, and it is just you and your neighbors and the city you have always lived in, and the terrible, clarifying, unbearable realization that everything you believed about the permanence of your world was a story you told yourself. And then, and this is the other lesson, the one that tends to get lost in the drama of collapse, you survive. Most of you survive. You hide and you negotiate and you help your neighbors and you pray or you curse and you wait for the worst to pass. And when it passes, when the soldiers march out and the silence returns, you come back out into the damaged, stripped, smoking reality of what remains. And you begin again. Not because you are heroes, not because you have been given a reason or a sign or a theological justification, but because that is what the living do. That is what the people of Rome did on August 27th, 410. They came out of their hiding places. They looked at what remained, and they began. If this investigation has raised questions for you, if there are aspects of those 48 hours that you want to explore further, sources you want to read, debates you want to understand more deeply, I would encourage you to start with 3 books. Peter Heather's The Fall of the Roman Empire, Bryan Ward-Perkins' The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, and Augustine's own The City of God, not just as theology, but as the raw, urgent, sometimes anguished response of an extraordinarily intelligent man trying to make sense of a world that had just cracked open. They will not give you simple answers, but the best history never does. What are your thoughts on those 48 hours? What aspect of this story surprised you most? What questions do you wish the sources had answered? Leave them below, because 1,500 years later, the conversation about what happened when Rome fell and what it means for us, here, now, in our own cities, in our own moment of civilizational uncertainty, is not finished. It may never be finished. And that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be. What are your thoughts on those 48 hours? What aspect of this story surprised you most? What questions do you wish the sources had answered? Leave them below, because 1,500 years later, the conversation about what happened when Rome fell and what it means for us, here, now, in our own cities, in our own moment of civilizational uncertainty, is not finished. It may never be finished. And that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be.